Hey, welcome to our New York Giants Preservation Society meeting for today, February 29th, 2024. Happy leap year, everybody. Tonight we have Lew Freedman. Lew has a new book out, Tales from the Clubhouse. Great baseball moments remembered. Many of you might remember Lew. He has spoken in the last couple of years on Johnny Mize and also his book on Juan Marichal. And he's got a brand new book out on Hoyt Wilhelm. Brand spanking new, just came out. This book today we're going to speak about is also new. So Lew will come back in June or July and talk about Hoyt Wilhelm. Just some other news going on. Next month, which is tomorrow, we're going to dedicate March to spring training at the Giants. On March 7th, we will have Greg Elliott. Greg is the head groundskeeper at Oracle Park. We'll talk about getting the stadium ready for the year and how they go about getting games ready whenever the Giants are playing. Marty Laurie, who is the weekend host of the pregame. We originally had him scheduled for March 14th. We're going to have to move that up to March 13th. So that'll be a Wednesday. On March 21st, Charlie Vessalero. Charlie is a historian on spring training for both the New York Giants and the San Francisco Giants. And we'll wrap it up. I know a lot of you guys here are very interested in the Giants minor leagues, and there's nobody better than Roger Munter. And he will join us on March 27th. I know the judge will definitely be here for that one. So without any further ado, I would love to welcome back, a really great author who putting out a lot of stuff. Lew Freedman. Lew, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's always fun. Hey, and one thing that just flitted through my mind as the guys were talking about the 0-0 game. Many years ago, when I was working in Philadelphia, before college football went to overtime and had more ties, I actually covered 2 0-0 games in the same season. Ooh. I never saw one before that, and I never saw one after that. And of course, now they don't happen with the tiebreaker rule. So 2 0-0 games. I think it was the fall of 1979.
Who were the teams?
Lehigh and Lafayette. And it was small college football. And Swarthmore, which was Division III, and I can't remember who they played. They were the home team in the local area of Philly. But 2 0-0 games. And of course, you don't get it anymore. And I don't think I've ever heard of 0-0 baseball. And I don't.
Oh. Yeah, Lou, I'm sorry. I'll have to mute this person.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Anyway, so that came through my mind when you guys were bringing up that they stopped. And I hope they only stopped because they figured there was no reason to go on because it was spring training. So it didn't really count anyway. So we hate to see that kind of changeover, right? Yeah. I don't know what the longest game you guys have ever seen. I know I have seen 21 innings, 3 different times though. So by the time I got to the third one, I was kind of rooting for it to go to the 22nd, just so I could say it was the longest game I'd ever seen. One of them started at 7:30 at night in Seattle. And it went till like 1:30 or something like that. And I think it was the Mariners and the Red Sox. Another time I saw a White Sox game in the stands, but it was like a noon start on a Sunday. So it didn't feel so bad, and it went 6.5 hours. And then the third time was an Alaska Baseball League game that was on a weeknight with the Anchorage Glacier Pilots. And I can't remember who they were playing, but there were one of the things I did was run down from the press box when the game ended to count the number of people leaving just to see who had stayed until 1 o'clock in the morning. And I heard later that the neighbors, and it was the ballpark in Anchorage is It's right up against almost an apartment building. I guess some of them called and complained about the loudspeaker going on so late. And so they stopped announcing people near the end of the game sometime after midnight because the neighbors had complained about the noise value. Anyway, so that's my personal record for longest games that ever counted, 21 innings, 3 different times. So I don't know if I'll ever see one longer. I don't know how badly I do want to break that record either. That much prefer if it was a day game, I think, than something that was going to go on till 1:30 in the morning like the other ones had. But anyway, my most recent book, which just came out in December, it's called Tales from the Clubhouse. And what it really is a collection and a massaging of and a variation of 55 different interviews I've done goes back 50 years of writing off and on about baseball in different newspapers in different parts of the country. The oldest 2 go back to the very early 70s. One was with Tony Canigliaro, and the other was with Bill Veeck. And I'm probably the only person who only ever interviewed Bill Veeck about his horse racing days, but I managed to steer the conversation. It was when he wrote his book about his days as the president of Suffolk Downs, which is a horse racing track on the outskirts of Boston, although I think it's out of business now. And during one of his intermissions from ownership in baseball, he ran Suffolk Downs for a couple of years, and he wrote a book called 30 Tons a Day, which doesn't leave a lot to the imagination to get what the tons of what it was. And of course, he was delightful to talk to, but I did steer the conversation a little bit, as young as I was at the time, to get him to talk a little bit about baseball. And so those are the oldest 2. You guys, I can see, are sort of contemporaries of mine, so you guys remember who Tony Canigliaro was too. For the Red Sox, who was a young star, led the American League in home runs by the time he was 21, and had his tragic career where he was hit by a pitch during the Red Sox season of, the Impossible Dream season of 1967. And he never really, he had a few comebacks from that, but it cut short his career, and he kept having vision problems. So and then he died young as well from a heart attack. But there are Giants connections in the book. I think Gary and I counted up that there were 5. I've spoken about Juan Marshall before, but I included sort of a condensed version of the chapter with Juan, because that might be the most fun I ever have going to do an interview, because I went to see him in the Dominican Republic, and it's the only time I've ever been there. And I spent days with him, doing interviews. And he was just a delightful guy to be around, as well as the great pitcher that he was. But just hanging out with him in his home area was kind of neat, because anytime we went out somewhere, he was immediately recognized, and fans, of course, asked for autographs or came up to him at the dinner table. And the other Giants connections in here would be, I think, Dusty Baker, although the story that Dusty is involved in telling was from when he was manager of the Cincinnati Reds, when I actually covered the Reds a few years back. Johnny Mize in here? No. Willie Mays. I have some interesting Willie Mays background because, of course, the all-time Giant probably. I was too young to really see, growing up in Boston, an American League city, I was too young to see Willie Mays play in person as a National Leaguer, and, him retiring. But when, after he retired from baseball, I don't know how many of you guys remember this, he went to work as a greeter for an Atlantic City casino. And that was the time when those casinos in Atlantic City were sort of the hub of boxing in the professional world, except for the absolute biggest fights. But there was a fight about every other week at some casino when I was the boxing writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And so often enough, I would see Willie Mays, in Atlantic City. I think he was making 100,000 a year at the time, because as Bowie Kuhn was banned him from baseball, both he and Mickey Mantle. Mantle had a similar job after he retired, and Bowie didn't want them connected to baseball because of the gambling situation, which is extremely ironic these days, of course, when I believe there is a gambling betting parlor next door or at the front gate in Cincinnati when you walk into a game. And and there's an advertisement for every kind of gambling on every kind of game you watch these days. So things have changed a bit since that time period of the early 1980s when I saw Willie Mays all the time. And it started with just mostly, hello, how you doing? And I finally trapped him once to sit down and talk. And we had a couple of seats in the lobby or off to the hallway at one of the casinos. And I did a fun interview with Mays about baseball, not boxing, to be honest for them. Although he had some pretty strong thoughts about being shunted out of the game by Bowie Kuhn. And then I went from Philadelphia to Alaska and was working for the Anchorage Daily News starting in 1984. And the first summer I was there, who's in town making a personal appearance at the downtown Alaska Baseball League ballpark, but Willie Mays, and saw him again. So those are the kind of situations that I actually got to talk to Willie Mays and interview him about. And 1984, and that was the last time I've ever seen him. So it's been that long now. But for that stretch of time, I would see him all the time, and that was kind of cool. After all, as we are prone to say, it's Willie Mays, so it's always kind of special when a guy like that, is available and to talk to. I'm thinking who else there were a couple of other guys that had Giants connections in here.
You have a couple of people who have hands raised that I guess they want to ask you a question.
That's fine.
Yeah,
That's fine.
We'll wait for that till we're done with our.
Okay, anytime. It's okay with me. And I'm trying to think of who else. There was a couple other guys I think who passed through the Giants that weren't as well. Hoyt Wilhelm was in this book. As Gary mentioned, much to my surprise, I had done a Hoyt Wilhelm biography, and of course, he spent so much time in the beginning of his major league career with the New York Giants, and I just didn't expect the book to show up as quickly as it did. So I actually have one. But this is, the other book came out in the beginning of December. This one just showed up at the house like a week or so ago. Again, earlier than I expected. I thought we'd be well into the season. But so I'll be happy to talk about Hoyt Wilhelm later. But I did meet Hoyt Wilhelm and interview him in the 70s, the late 70s at spring training in Florida. So there's another Giants connection. And of course, he had his own remarkable career. Dusty Baker and I never really talked much about his time with the Giants because at the time I was seeing him all the time. He was the manager of the Reds. They haven't recovered from that yet. Look what he's done. He's won a World Series with Houston, and the Reds haven't been back to the playoffs. I guess people are predicting they have a pretty good young team now, and they, I guess they reached the 500 level barely or close to it last year, but that's the first time in years. I was still covering the team the last time they went to the playoffs when they lost, and it's been a while now. So I'm sort of living in Reds territory, meaning I'm 80 miles away, but it's the closest major league team to me at this point. So my wife and I go whenever we can, half a dozen times or so a season, make a road trip. And when I started to think about this book, I was surprised myself about how many of the great names that of the game that I was lucky enough to come across, in different parts. Part of that is a reflection of the fact that I moved around a lot during my newspaper career. And so I was in different regions. I mean, I grew up in Boston. I lived in minor league territory in Syracuse at one point, but the Philadelphia Inquirer I was lucky enough to be there and working when they won the World Series in 1980. And then when I was in Alaska, I would go to the Mariners, for 3 games at a time, like in a summer trip, take a week in Seattle and go to 3 games in a row and have a connection with the team and interview some guys that way. But and some of the other guys that are in here were people I interviewed for other book projects. But I was surprised when I came down, I had a list of people. I wondered if I'd have enough people. And then when I started to do it, I had too many and had to start leaving out some pretty good guys, not Hall of Famers, but I believe there's 34 Hall of Famers in the book and a few guys who we know will be in the Hall of Fame. One of those being Albert Pujols. And Dusty Baker, I think at this point has solidified his managing credits. So we think pretty sure he's going to be in there. And then there's been some fascinating interviews with, lesser stars. I mean, everybody in this group is a baseball fan. And you guys all know the story of Jim Abbott, I'm sure. But how many people know anything about another Jim Abbott who pitched in the majors, who was a young guy from Alaska, who had the same affliction? And you probably don't even know his name, but he's a chapter in here, and he's a fascinating guy. That guy's name is Chad Bentz. I don't know how many, you can raise your hands if you want to, but I don't know how many you even remember Chad as a guy who barely had a cup of coffee. He's a guy who had a cup of coffee in the majors that was so small that he didn't even get the sugar in the coffee, But I mean, he pitched a few games for Montreal and a couple of people, and he did not win a game in his across 2 seasons. But Chad is from Juneau, Alaska. And when I was a sports writer, I was a sports writer of the Anchorage Daily News. Chad was a high school athlete. And I first encountered him when he was playing high school football. And then he went off to college and he came back for the Alaska Summer Baseball League and signed up with the Anchorage Glacier Pilots and pitched for them for 2 summers, I believe. So I had a chance to actually watch him in his baseball environment. And then he did go through the minors and make it to the majors, which was, a guy who with one hand, much, like Jim Abbott. It's kind of remarkable. But again, he did not have the longevity, didn't pitch a no-hitter like Abbott or anything like that. And then after he kind of peaked out, those years of, briefly in the majors, he went back to college and he played Division III football for college. I think as a fullback, as he finished his degree, went back to his hometown in Juneau. And last I heard, I don't know if it's true today, but up until recently, he was the athletic director at his old high school too. So this is the guy who had quite the athletic story. And again, I don't know how many people have ever pitched in the majors with only having one hand. We know about Pete Gray, of course, too, as a variation of that. But pitching, I mean, we all think of Jim Abbott and Chad Bentz. Probably it would have been nice if he won the 1 game, I suppose. But he's quite the guy. And again, a lesser known story than many of the Hall of Famers you hear about in here. I mean, another guy like that is Bronson Arroyo, who you guys all heard of and had a pretty good career. I think he won about 145 games. He was with the Reds when I was covering them. And he was one of those guys, if you went to his locker after a game, you always knew you were going to have fun talking. And it's always great to have guys like that in a clubhouse. And, you never know what they're going to say. And usually it's entertaining. And they never shy away because they got belted around or anything. He's a stand-up guy that time. And one time, I forget what started the conversation, but we ended up veering off to when he was in his property of the Red Sox And he had pitched a perfect game with Pawtucket in AAA, which I was unaware of at the time. I didn't look it up and everything. And we got to talking about that. And I thought, no, there's an unusual story. How many guys even pitch a perfect game in AAA? You know, we know how few they are. We can probably name most of them in the majors. But, you know, obviously more have in AAA, but you could probably have them happen and never hear about them because the minors don't get that attention across the country. Or you might get a blurb on the internet these days if there is one. So that was, again, a fascinating, unexpected story, which of course is always fun when you're talking with a guy and there's nobody else around. It's just you and him. It's not one of those scrums with 12 guys gathered around the player, trying to elbow your way in so you can hear them. But and you're just standing there. He's in no hurry and he's happy to tell a story that was a fun part of his life. And that's what some of these are too. Tommy John is in here, and that came to pass because 2 summers ago, I was doing a story. I work in Seymour, Indiana these days for a small newspaper part-time. And I was doing a feature story in the summer on the Indiana Baseball Hall of Fame. And I went to visit it. It was I don't know, it's 50, 60 miles away from me. And I just thought it would be a neat story and see who's in it. There's some real old timers from Indiana in it who are unavailable to talk to since they've been dead for 80 years. But with some more recent ones. And Tommy John was one. And I was able to get a hold of him in Florida and talk to him about his career. And also he was on my mind because I don't know how much you guys follow basketball, but the Indianapolis, the Pacers in the NBA were coached for quite some time by a popular guy here who was named Bob Leonard, who was in the Hall of Fame and then was a longtime broadcaster. Bob just passed away in his 90s a couple years ago. And I wrote his biography, and he told me that when he grew up in Terre Haute, which is where Tommy John is from, and Tommy was the ball boy on Bob's high school basketball team back in the 50s. And anyway, and I mentioned it to Tommy at the time, and he said, that's true, I did that. And he talked to me a little bit about his early pitching days in Indiana. He was such a good pitcher. He was playing on, town teams and barnstorming teams. And one of his stories that was kind of amusing and different was that team went to play. There's a prison in Terre Haute, and Tommy John was the pitcher when they brought the team to play in the prison. And John pitched a great game, struck out about 15 guys or so. The manager of the prison team, who was an inmate, asked him if he could stick around a little longer and maybe fill in for their team. But he chose not to do that or stay around. But he was a very entertaining guy to talk to. And it was really a close call that he actually chose baseball because apparently he was just about as good a basketball player in high school and had multiple scholarship offers from big Division I schools. And he was about to enroll at the University of Georgia and play basketball when he changed his mind and went to baseball, and led to his career, which he's in the top few guys all time, I think, for wins who are not in the Hall of Fame. He's around 285, and there's only a couple of guys, especially since Jim Cott got in, in recent years, there's only a couple of guys who've ever won more games than Tommy John who are not in the Baseball Hall of Fame. And it's kind of bizarre that he's become a cultural name because of his arm surgery, which he kind of laughs about himself. He takes it well, but you can walk down the street and people who are not baseball fans, and you mention Tommy John and they know about the arm surgery and not the pitcher. I mean, I've tested it a few times. I mean, it cracks people up, and he has fun with it. He, when people talk to him about it. So it's a bizarre legacy when you think about it. But one of the story that he told me, and it actually related, and I was talking, he was a teammate of Hoyt Wilhelm's too. So it spills over into my other project in the sense that um, when he had this arm surgery and he gave himself 2 years to come back, and he only sat out 1 year. And he was able to come back, and it changed history and medical history as well as sports history. But he told me, and I had never heard this anywhere else, that he planned to give it a shot to learn the knuckleball from Hoyt Wilhelm if he could not regain his stuff to pitch in the majors. He said he was going to go wherever Hoyt was in spring training and throw with him for a month to learn the knuckleball, but he never had to do it because he was able to come back. But that's a twist on Tommy John surgery and Tommy's career that I had never read about or heard about anywhere else before that. And nor have I heard anybody else, talk about it since when I mentioned the story occasionally. So, did you want to do questions, Gary, or?
Yeah, I just we'll go to questions. Lou, best way to get the book? Amazon?
Probably, yeah. It's Blue River Press, which is an imprint of Cardinal Publishing in Indianapolis too. You could go right through them. That's the only time I've ever lived near a publisher that I worked with. So I got to know the people at the place. Sometimes, I've worked for people over the years and the decades that I never even met, and they may be gone or they don't do my stuff anymore or other projects, but this is one where they're only like about a half hour, 40-minute drive from my house. So
You mentioned Dusty Baker is beloved to this group because of his time with the Giants, and he didn't talk about it in this book. Did he spend a lot of time talking about his relationship on the Braves with Hank Aaron?
He talked a little bit about it, and really the story that I talked to him about that fascinated me and that I cited in this book back, I don't know. How long has it been since he left the Reds? Maybe the year before his last year. We happened to be in the manager's office leading into a game that night, and it was the night before the major league draft. And we just kind of said, there were 3 or 4 of us at that point. What do you remember about your situation in the late 60s? It was right, 68, something like that was when he got drafted. And how you felt and what you wanted to happen in the draft the next day. And he went off on this fantastic soliloquy. In fact, everybody else was gone after the first question except me. I thought it was a fantastic story. He talked about how he was happy to go to any other team except the Atlanta Braves because he did not want to go, as a black man, did not want to go to the Deep South at that time during the Civil Rights Movement. And he then said, and of course the Braves chose him. He was taken by the Braves and went to the Braves. And he talked about what a great experience it turned out to be. Unexpectedly, how he got to know, he became friendly with Hank Aaron, but he also became part of the community in the hotbed of really civil rights activity. And he got to know the leaders of the civil rights movement. And he said it was fantastically educational and one of the great experiences of his life when here he was dreading going to Atlanta.
My last question, do you have a favorite entry that you put in the book?
Boy, I tell you, to me, it's all tangled up with how I ended up doing the story. I mean, and the Dusty Baker one is one of those. I mean, spending time with one in the Dominican is Ted Williams is definitely the fact that it was Ted Williams. And I mean, I don't know if I've ever told the story to this group, but when I was a kid growing up in Boston, I used to listen to the Red Sox on the radio to fall asleep by when Kurt Gowdy was the play-by-play announcer. And in 1960, I was 9 years old, and my father said, let's go to a Red Sox game. And he and my grandfather and I went. This is my big first game ever, at Fenway Park. And we get there and he says, where do you want to sit? And of course, I don't have a clue. I don't know anything as a kid, about the layout of the ballpark and everything. So I said, let's sit in left field. So I figured I could be near Ted Williams. That was the reason. Had nothing to do with viewing the game, of course, because I was clueless. And we get there, we buy the tickets, we got seats in left field, far from home plate, right? And Ted Williams doesn't play that day. I still remember, if you guys remember, the somewhat obscure career of Gene Stevens, who played left field that day. And 18 years later, I was at spring training, walking across the field, headed towards the Red Sox were in Winter Haven, I believe at the time. So I was a prearranged visit to talk to players or whatever with a friend of mine who was a journalist. And we're crossing from the parking lot across the field to the ballpark, and coming the other way is this lone figure walking towards us, and it's Ted Williams. So I grab his attention and he stops to chat. And that's how I did the Ted Williams interview, standing in this field in the middle of nowhere, impromptu with my friend and nobody else around. Sort of, I always call it the full circle from the visit to the ballpark and not seeing him play in left field when I was a kid. And a few other people ended up gathering around that recognized him. But I don't expect this to be the situation these days, but they didn't interrupt. They didn't ask for autographs. They just respectfully listened to us talking, which when I think back of it, maybe that was the most surprising part of it all. And then after about 15 minutes, I mean, he couldn't walk out on a question on hitting, is what it seemed like. He clapped me on the shoulder and said, I got to go, man. And that was my Ted Williams interview. So that was, in some ways the greatest interview, even if he might not have been the greatest, content per se, but he was certainly good. And that was a special occasion.
Thanks, Lou. We'll go Mars, Bill, Jim, Howard, and Norm. Mars, you're up.
And Frank,
And
thank you
too,
for
Frank.
thank you for joining us. So I'd like to know, in lieu of now gambling that's even advertised during games, what is your opinion on reinstating Pete Rose, Jim Thorpe, Shoeless Joe Jackson, to reinstate them so they could go to the Hall of Fame? That's my first question. And so we'll go. My second question is what you think of the state of baseball today and expansion. It seems like a lot of teams aren't drawing well anyway. So let's, if you could address the first one about the reinstatement in the Hall of Fame of the players I just mentioned.
I think there are three different cases. I personally knew Pete Rose from starting with the Phillies days and followed up and interviewed him later in life, more recently. I thought as soon as baseball, I've written columns. I was writing about one a year, although I haven't in a couple of years now, but for a while, that Pete Rose, his suspension should be lifted, that he had spent essentially the equivalent of 30 years in jail and deserved to be paroled. Now that baseball was basically in bed with gambling. He had served enough time anyway with all those decades, but the fact that that baseball was doing what it was doing with gambling kind of made it a hypocrisy on the part of baseball to keep him out. So that's the Pete Rose version, and that's how I feel about him and the Hall of Fame, that he should be paroled essentially from his lifetime suspension and be put on the Hall of Fame ballot. I don't know if anybody ever considered Jim Thorpe for the Baseball Hall of Fame, right? He only hit like about 250 something, didn't he? I mean, he had his Olympic medals restored, and he is in the Football Hall of Fame, I believe.
Yeah. Oh, his medals were restored. Okay. What about Shoeless Joe Jackson?
Shoeless Joe's a much more complicated situation, and I've read as much as you can read. There's so much of whether he really understood what he was doing, whether he really was illiterate or not. I know that Ted Williams was one person who did campaign for him to get in. And I just don't think anything's ever going to happen with Shoeless Joe. And I think that so much time has passed and there's so much murkiness about it that no one will ever get full clarity about really what his role was. We've seen it in the movies. Was it 8 Men Out, where they walk in his bedroom and they leave the envelope on the top of the dresser or stuff. But I mean, it stops short of him really saying, I did this, but he gets portrayed as ignorant.
But he had a great series. He had a very good World Series.
And was a very appealing player.
So what do you think about the state of baseball today and considering further expansion?
Well, less about expansion, but I mean, you guys must have had some interesting reactions the way I did when they announced all the rules changes for last year. I was skeptical, and yet when it played out, I thought the clock and everything worked out great. I have to admit, what I don't like is putting the runner on second base in extra innings because it's not deserved. It's not earned. So that's the one rule that but I think all the other things that they adopted with pitching speed and the clock all worked out pretty well. And I think that's is helping attendance. So it's hard to say what the ripple effect will be for how long. As far as expansion goes, I don't know who's the most deserving city these days. I know there's a couple people that have been agitating for it for some time. The Florida teams don't draw that well, do they? Everybody thought that was a no-brainer. I mean, thinking back, didn't you guys think with all the history and spring training that it was going to be a success?
No. One of the reasons that it doesn't work in Florida, because it's not a union state. There's a lot, therefore the wages are low, and then you have the retirement community that can't afford to pay high ticket prices. So it never really should have been in Florida. And Tampa Bay wants a new stadium, but it's not going to do any good because look what happened in Miami.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I don't know if either one of those are likely to move, and I don't know where. I mean, now that Las Vegas is having a team, I don't know who the number one city contender is.
They're not going to draw in Vegas. They'll draw for hockey and because it's 40 games and it's indoors. But when you have people at night are going to go to the shows and they're going to want to gamble. So 81 home games for baseball is never going to work. And I believe the owner Fisher, after the value of the team will increase by several million. After he sees that, he's going to sell that team. It's never going to work in Vegas. Never. It'll work for hockey.
I'm open-minded about that because Las Vegas has two very distinct populations. The residents are always looking for entertainment that's not in a casino. So, which might be why the hockey and the football have been so popular, and the population has grown. So it's just part of living there.
Sorry. One of the detriments is that there's not enough acreage for a retractable roof. They would need 12 acres, and so far that lot is 9 acres. So it'd be an open roof with 100 degrees. Who would want to sit and swelter?
That would be a drawback. I know the last time I was in Las Vegas some years ago, 5 years or so, it was 110 and 115 during the day, just walking around. All you wanted to do was get to the next building with air conditioning.
All right, let's move on to Bill. Bill,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Gary. Thank you, Lou. Lou, before I get to my comments, and I'll 3 snippet sort of questions. I want to insert one word regarding Tommy John that has brought his stock way up, or at least his interest. The one word is underwear. I mean, that's what people think of now. So, I mean, there are no other ball players that have that, that dimension to them. So, okay.
Jim Palmer used to. Do you
Well,
remember?
yeah, but it wasn't his name, okay.
Well,
I
he,
agree with
he
you,
actually came to Anchorage at the height of his underwear thing. And women took days off, lunch hour time off from work to go see him. Because they had seen the picture of him in his underwear.
And boy, he's right. That happened.
Yeah. I mean, it was crazy. I mean, I went to the event, and afterwards I talked to some of the women who had left their offices and took the rest of the afternoon off or whatever, because I wanted to see Jim Palmer, the guy from the underwear commercials. Obviously a long time ago, but
one of the other things I really like what you've had to say for another reason. And I'm not trying to put down other people who have come on here, but we have a lot of people who have a lot of depth in one city and they know it. They grew up within the city and they know baseball in that city, and they wrote for a paper in that city and they've written books, and that's all fine and well. What I like about you is, man, you've been everywhere. You're the peripatetic Lew. You've been everywhere, and some cool
too
places.
many places. I don't know.
Listen, I want to ask you about one. It's a personal thing. When you were with the Inquirer, did you know a guy who covered hockey by the name of Jay Greenberg? Did you
A little
know
bit.
Jay?
He was at the Daily News, the other
He
paper.
was at the Daily News, and he started at the Inquirer. He was at the Bulletin. He kind of moved around the three papers.
Yeah, but I didn't see him that often because during that time period he was at the Daily News, and we only saw each other to say hello to once in a while.
He
And I
wrote a
didn't
great
go to
book.
much. I didn't go to much hockey.
Yeah, he wrote the absolute best book on the Flyers. That's a what do you call it? A coffee table book.
Okay.
But here's my story. I'll make it quick on him. I spent my sophomore year at the University of Missouri with Jay, and he had one goal in life, and that was he was going to be a hockey writer. Now, not many guys go to college and they singly want one thing and they achieve it, but Jay did, and he was a wonderful guy. Unfortunately, he passed away from Lyme disease a few years ago.
Yeah, it was not that long ago, and he wasn't that old.
He wasn't that old, and I wish I had gotten in touch with him. I'm trying to do that with a lot of people, but he was a wonderful guy. My final thing on him, and I'll move on to some questions for you. He came to our home in Palo Alto in 1969 for Christmas, and my mother asked him, "Would you like to have one egg or two?" And Jay, as only Jay would say, "I'll have three."
Oh, okay.
Jay was an only child. He got whatever he wanted, But if my mother was here, she would say, "Jay, yeah, 3 eggs."
Yeah,
But
she remember, huh?
she remembers. Yeah. Your reactions on a guy that was around the corner and he just died recently. A gullet just died a couple of days ago. He had like a .658 winning percentage.
Don Gullet, is that what you said?
Don Gullet. Yeah.
Yes, I did take note of that. He had a great winning percentage in a career that was cut short by injury.
It was, but he only had 1 year where he had a losing record. And when he won, he was winning 60 to 70% of his games. The guy was, he was spot on that. Absolutely. I wanted to ask you this other one thing. When you were covering sports and it went into those extra inning things, okay, it's getting to be 1 o'clock in the morning. You're not going to make the Bulldog edition. But what were you doing? How did you put the stories together so you could get something in? Because people have got to be on the phone. Lew, we need the first graph. What do you got for us?
It was nuts whenever that happened. Although I did not cover baseball on a daily basis on deadline. So I did not have that problem as much. I ran into it on other sporting events and other occasions. I mean, even when I was covering boxing, they were still having 15-round title fights.
Yeah.
And we were starting in Las Vegas, and I'm working for an East Coast newspaper. So even by the time it starts, you're barely going to make it.
Yeah.
And I wrote every 3 rounds, I wrote something and sent it in.
Right.
The second the decision was announced, I sent it in, then went to the locker rooms and wrote a new story. And I was so late sometimes, like you said, those editions, that you're only going to make 4,000 papers in the street boxes downtown that people were putting a quarter into. And the
Right.
rest of the people weren't gonna get the story of the game. Actually, because, and so you're writing the next day a follow-up. So
Yeah,
that would
yeah,
happen. And one of those all-timers was when I was in Chicago and I was at the NCAA basketball in Buffalo covering DePaul. And if you look at how they're structured, they usually have 2 games in a session at night. So the night session started late. So the second game started late and they went to like double overtime. And
Jeez.
that was one of those times, like you said, with the phone, the copy editor was saying, we got to have something. I said, and I would say, the game's not over. I can't tell you what happened. I mean,
Yeah.
so that was one of those days where almost nobody read about it because there was
I'll
nothing
leave-
you could do.
I'll leave you with this. There was a great, and you may remember this, but these guys will remember it. And that's Liston Alley 2. And now that one, this
Well, I was
is
a
not,
kid, but I remember seeing,
this was not the massacre in, in Miami. This was the lame duck session in Lewiston. Okay. But
Right.
here's the question, and see who knows. Norm, so I know you're out, Norm. You can't answer this. Lou, you may know it. Who did the national broadcast on radio for that fight? Ali and Liston in Lewiston. Folks, you know this guy. You know him.
I'd be winging it and say
Les
either
Kiter?
Howard Cosell or Don Dunphy,
So
but I wouldn't be sure.
how about Les Kiter? Well,
Nope. How about Mr. Lon Simmons? Lon Simmons.
wow.
It's called.
Okay.
He was a great boxing announcer in his own right, but I'm a Hodges fan from way back. Norm, did you know that one? You didn't. Okay, all right. I figured you would.
All right.
Bill. All right. Fellow Alaskan, Jim Weber.
Hey, Lou, I've
Hey,
known
Jim,
Lou
how are you?
I'm good. I've known Lou's writings for well over 35 years, having lived there in Alaska. I just wanted to tell you, Chad Benz, as far as I know, he's still the athletic director and the physical education teacher there at Juneau Douglas High School.
Good. I hadn't
he's-
heard differently, but I hadn't checked on it.
Right. I don't know if folks really realize, about the young man. He had both arms, but he only had a left hand. He did not have a hand on his right arm. And, the Jim Abbott story is very similar. And the kid did quite well, especially when he was playing there for Miami. I also wanted to just mention to you, my wife and I went to see Bruce Bochy's running around our town here in Surprise in Arizona, which is where his team, the Rangers, and Kansas City call home for spring ball. So we went to the game today to see the Rangers play the Brewers. Now we had to leave early. We had to leave before the 7th inning was over, but there was 18 hits in the game, 7-5 Brewers were winning. And I'll tell you, they were playing some rock'em sock'em baseball, and Bochy really fielded one hell of a team so far. I don't know how they're going to go for the rest of the year, but spirited and a lot of fun. So appreciate all your comments and your good writings, Lou. Thank you.
You think you must be in a warmer place than Soldotna right now.
Well, that's very true. It was probably close to 80 degrees here today.
Oh,
Thanks,
So
Jim.
we're lucky. We had seats in the shade, so it was just most delightful.
that's even better.
I'm glad you guys connected today on the internet with the email. So, Howard Manis, you were up.
Thanks, Gary. Hi, Lou.
Hi,
Just a
Howard.
couple of questions and comments. I agree with you about the ghost runner. I think most of us do. I'm a traditionalist. I even hate the automatic based on balls. I mean, I've seen pitches hit batters and, and
Yeah.
wild pitches.
I
and all that.
forgot that. I'm not psyched about that, but it doesn't offend me the way the other one does.
Well,
I guess.
I always, until now, I've accepted it. I didn't even like the DH. But the worst thing, and I don't know how you feel about it, is this crazy thing that you have to play every single team. I mean, it stinks. It used to be you had rivals. You'd play 18 games. I'm a New Yorker. Mets against the Giants. I used to be a Giant fan too. Mets against the Dodgers. Mets against the Cubs. 9-9. 1-9 at home, 9 away. But now, you're forced to play, the Minnesota Twins or the Seattle Mariners, and they're based in New York in the National League. I mean, the leagues are disappearing. I mean, there are no more league presidents, which to me, that's not a big deal. But I don't like the scheduling. It's ridiculous. I mean, the Giants come in 3 times a year. And by the way, Gary, I'm going to see a Giant game this year. I have a partial season ticket plan. So I'm like you. I'm a traditionalist. I have a couple of questions for you. When did you live and work in Syracuse?
70 for 2 years, right smack in the middle of the 70s, like 75 to I think early 77.
Okay. I went to
Yeah.
Syracuse University and I graduated in 75.
You went
And
to
once I-
Archibald Stadium then, right? And sat
Well,
on the
yeah,
you sit on the
football.
concrete there?
Yeah, in the snow and in the cold and the rain and smoke marijuana. Yeah, I
Yeah.
remember that it was yesterday. But we used to take trips. Well, first of all, we would go to was it MacArthur Stadium? Is that where the Syracuse baseball team? They were Yankees. I think they were Yankee farm team. Now
Yeah,
they're a
they
Met
were.
team. Now they're just,
Ron Guidry was there when I was there.
well, the Syracuse Mets now play there. They were the Chiefs, and then there was somebody else.
Yeah.
So we went to several games, and we also took car trips. We went one time up to Jarry Park in Montreal in April, and big mistake. It was, maybe Alaska's worse, but it was really cold. But my friends and I, being in our early 20s, nothing could hurt us. We were indestructible. One more question for you, because you mentioned a lot about Alaska. You must be aware that Tom Seaver pitched in Alaska. I think the Alaska Gold Panthers.
The Alaska Baseball League, the Alaska Gold Panthers. Yeah.
I think he did that during the summer, right? It was a semi-pro league. And
Yep, it was summer. And there's been hundreds of guys, literally hundreds, who have come through there who made the majors. But he was one of the earliest big names. And there's only a handful of Hall of Famers who
right
came through there. And he was one of them. Dave
And
Winfield was another one.
And on the East Coast, I don't know if it's as good as the Alaska League, but we have the Cape Cod League.
Yes.
Is very well known for baseball. And we live only 4 hours away from Massachusetts. And, when the kids were young, when my kids were young, we'd go up there and take in a game of the Cape Cod League, which was a lot of fun.
This summer, my sister moved there. She lives right near the Bourne Bridge.
Okay. I know that bridge very well. So, minor league baseball is fun. I mean, I've gone to some of the games here, the Somerset Patriots. I haven't been to them in a couple of years now, but they used to be an independent league, and they were, and now they belong to the Yankees. I believe they're a Yankee farm team now, an official farm team of the Yankees. And Sparky Law was their manager for several years. And, a lot of people wanted pictures taken, from, or autographs, I should say, of Sparky in a Yankee uniform or a Red Sox uniform. He would not sign Red Sox. He was only a Yankee.
I didn't know he had that feeling.
Yeah, he refused. It could be the cutest little kid in the world. Mr. Lau, here's my Red Sox card from 19, whatever it was. Nope, sorry, kid. You got to be with a Yankee uniform. Wow. That was a shtick of his. He just refuse any other uniform that he might have worn, especially the Red Sox.
You're wearing a Rangers hat, not a Bruins hat. So,
well, I'm from New York.
Yeah.
I'm a Ranger fan.
Rangers are having a good year.
Yeah.
Oh, I was at a game a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, they're definitely having a good year.
I had a classmate in 5th grade whose father was the trainer of the Rangers, a guy named Frank Pace, and they used to get me tickets for the Old Garden back in the early 60s. But baseball's always been my first love. My family were New York Giant fans, and then the Mets came along, and I've explained it to these guys a million times that they're probably bored, to tears already. But I did want to ask you about Syracuse and Seaver at Anchorage, and it was a pleasure meeting you tonight. Thank you.
Oh, I got to tell you, as long as I lived in Anchorage, which is 17 years, never had as much snow in a winter as my record in Syracuse. Syracuse had more.
They can't play night games, Ken. I mean, the sun never sets in July.
Well, they didn't have it in July, but they did have the most snow I ever went through in winter in Syracuse.
Yeah.
So
my wife went to school in Buffalo. You think Syracuse and Alaska are bad? Go to Buffalo.
Oh yeah, Buffalo's.
Shuffle off to Buffalo, as they
There
say.
were always some record snowfalls in Buffalo, and then they would move out, and then they would move east to Syracuse.
And by the way, one last thing. You remember there was the movie Slapshot?
Yeah, they filmed
Paul
part of it
Newman.
in Syracuse. I went to, they had people at the Onondaga War Memorial wearing winter coats like in July or something.
Yeah, well,
Were
it
you in
was,
the, were you in the crowd?
I went to several games, but not, I probably wore winter coats because it was, you had to wear winter coats in late September up in Syracuse. But we, a lot of fights, just like in the movie. And in the movie, there was an imaginary team called the Syracuse Bulldogs. And that was like at the very end of the movie, the big showdown between Paul Newman's team, the Chiefs, I
Right.
guess they were called, and the Hanson brothers, and against the big bad Bulldogs. So, you know,
It
Syracuse
was
is
a
also
minor
bastard.
league team that was visiting Syracuse when I was at the game, where in the game, some of the visiting teams went into the stands swinging sticks. I remember that. It's the only time I've ever seen that in my life.
Well, minor league hockey is something to really behold. Thank you, Lou.
All right,
Thank you.
Norm Coleman, you are up.
Lou, thank you for being with us. I have a couple of comments and a question for you. First comment is Tony Conigliaro does have a Giants connection. I don't know if you can see this or not, but this is a Giants yearbook cover from 1980, and on his leg here, it's signed by Conigliaro. Reason I got that was because after he retired from baseball,
When he was a broadcaster?
sports reporter, yes, for KGO, our local affiliate.
Yeah, I knew he was in the Bay Area there. I didn't
And
know
so-
that he ever had anything like that you could quantify with the Giants, though.
Well, he covered the Giants and he won an Emmy covering the Giants. So that was that. There are 3 players in your book connected with the Giants that you did not mention. Don Larson was in the 1962 World Series for the Giants. Randy Johnson won his 300th game for the Giants. And the one I'm going to ask you about is a New York Giant, Red Schoendienst. Can you tell us about him?
My interview and time spent with Red Schoendienst was also quite entertaining. I was the outdoors writer for the Chicago Tribune, in addition to the other sports I did. And there was this club in Southern Illinois that, for its fundraising purposes, had an annual event, but because they were so far south in Illinois, their allegiance was to the Cardinals, not to the Cubs or the White Sox. So they invited former Cardinals players to appear and participate. And they would come in a day or so before and drink at the bar, and then go out on the they were shooting, I don't know what kind of birds, pheasants or something, I'm trying to remember. But so Schoendienst, who I met the night before, first thing in the morning when I see him out hunting, he's riding in a golf cart instead of on foot, because he was already older than everybody else. I mean, he did live to a very long life, but he was out there in the woods, but he wasn't hiking through the trees. He was driving a vehicle, and he was used to get him to the hunting grounds. And then he would get out of the vehicle and go near the water and shoot and explain how he got the bird and everything. So that was where I came to Red Schoendienst, and it was well into retirement for him. And if he ever really retired until his last years, I'm not so sure, right? He was always around. Wasn't he always like a special advisor right up till the end?
I think he was, yes.
Of the Cardinals. Yeah, I don't know if he really ever retired, but that's how I came across Red Schoendienst. It was actually in an outdoor story more than baseball.
Okay, well, thank you, Lou.
Thank you, Norm. Frank Lewis and then the judge.
Lou, I want to thank you for the presentation. I have no questions, but concerning Tommy John, I want to point out that he and Lou Gehrig have a distinction, having medical conditions named after him. That most conditions are named for doctors: Parkinson's disease, Hodgkin's disease, chip test, salt vaccine. But then there's Lou Gehrig's disease and Tommy John surgery.
John surgery, I know it, and it's like I said, he can joke about it. That he's sometimes better known for the arm that got hurt than his lifetime of achievement. So he can be funny about it.
But if you mention Sandy Koufax, and if you mention Reynolds phenom, well, if you mention Reynolds phenom, everybody thinks of Sandy Koufax. Nobody
People don't mention it though. not like Tommy John in the common
I know they don't mention
vernacular.
it, but,
That's
you
the
know, that's what
difference.
stopped it.
Because I think even when we were talking before, I thought, who was a famous, tremendous pitcher whose career was ended prematurely because of an arm injury. And Sandy Koufax comes to mind first.
Yeah.
He was only 30 years old. But the average person doesn't know the name of an operation. And besides, it didn't work and he didn't come back, right?
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, in today's newspaper, I shouldn't say the paper, it was a story online. I'm reading about somebody who got hurt, and there's a casual mention of Tommy John surgery. Just routinely all the time. That really keeps his name out there, even if people don't think about what it's all about, and they don't know his story.
Thank you.
They might not remember his story as years go by.
Judge Jim, you're up.
Thanks, Gary. Lou, first of all, I got to react to your discussion of snowfall in Syracuse. I'm in Rochester, right down the road, and I just have to say that
that's a tie.
We win our share of battles between Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester with the snow.
I was going to say that's got to be a tie up there.
We did
That's
pretty
funny
well.
because I never spent that much time in Rochester, and as soon as I left Syracuse to go to Florida, I went to the Florida Times-Union, the Jacksonville paper, but in Tallahassee. Bet I wasn't there a week, and the Rochester paper called me. Well, they had two at the time.
Yeah.
Yep. So I don't remember whether it was the
Times-Union
Democrat,
and
the Chronicle. Yeah. And they called me up and offered me a job to come back to cover the Buffalo Bills, and I said, "Where were you a month ago?" I would have done it.
Stayed up here.
I would have stayed there, and I would have driven from Syracuse to Buffalo, but I had just moved thousands of miles to Florida. So I said, the timing is terrible.
Well, what I wanted to talk about was we've been talking about some of the long sporting events. The longest professional baseball game was the Rochester Red Wings and the Pawtucket Red Sox. It was a 33-inning baseball game.
Let's say 32. I couldn't remember.
It was 32, and then
I remember they postponed and it came back, but then they scored the winning run like in one inning.
In one inning, yeah. So
yeah,
they played 32,
how crazy was that?
innings. They played 32 innings the first night, and then they came back and after it was suspended, played one game.
That's the part I always remember, is that it was only one inning actually after that.
But just one interesting bit from that game, for Pawtucket, Wade Boggs played the whole game, and for the Rochester Red Wings, Cal Ripken played the full game. And
no surprise, right?
Yeah, right. He went 2 for 13. I just double checked. Okay. 13 at bats in one game. That's a long baseball game. But thank you. Enjoyed the presentation.
Game. Thanks.
Harvey Weinberg. Harvey, unmute. Harvey, muted.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Lou, did you ever interact with any of the New York sports writers like Red Smith, Dick Young?
Yes. It did. And a lot of it was through boxing. Because when I covered boxing as a beat in Philadelphia, it was the last real hotbed time when Hagler, Leonard, Hearns, and all those people. And there were many titleists and contenders from Philadelphia. And the fights moved to Atlantic City. But when there was a big fight, those guys would show up. The Red Smith and Dick Young. I met Red Smith at the Lake Placid Olympics. The media center was actually in the basement of the high school. They shut down the schools for the Olympics. It's such a small place.
Is that the Miracle on Ice year?
Yes, I covered that game. That was people don't believe it, maybe because they think you have to be 100 to have been there or something.
Well, what's his name said, do you believe in miracles? Yes.
Yeah, Al Michaels.
Al Michaels, who also announced for the Giants for a couple of years.
He's done everything. He was everywhere and done everything. But I met
Red Smith. The 89 earthquake series.
What do you remember about What do you remember about Red Smith?
I wish I could remember the punchline to the story, but he was sitting. There was a bar they turned room into at the high school for the media. When they closed it, and I just remembered sitting around, and he was there, and he was talking. You wanted to listen and learn stuff, and he would tell stories about Frank Graham. that sport, New York sports writer, because they were so close and all. And one of the ways I measure how old I am is because I know that Red Smith died in 1982. And that makes me feel really old. And but I was also near him at one of the title fights. When Sugar Ray Leonard was, before he won the title, or maybe it was the night he won his first title. Early on in his career, though, I remember oh shoot, I might be confusing him with Barney Nagler making this comment from the Daily Racing Form, where he was a sports columnist, Barney. Well, one of them, when we were walking out, when we were going to the locker room, made the comment he should give the name back to Sugar Ray, because he wasn't impressed with him compared to Sugar Ray Robinson. Of course, Sugar Ray Leonard got better after that too, but that was their initial impression. But Red Smith was a great guy. I didn't know him well. I just was lucky enough to, see him a few times. I mean, you guys remember Jim Murray probably too from the LA Times.
The Red
those
Smith,
guys all came to the big fights. That's how I was able to overlap with them.
And
Jim-
one quick thing about extra inning games. I think it was 1964. I watched it on TV. The Giants played the second game of a doubleheader against the Mets. It went 23 innings, and the Giants won on a hit by Del Crandall. That was the game Willie Mays, among other things, played shortstop for an inning or two.
Really? I didn't know he did.
Well,
I do remember Del Crandall.
Well, I'm convinced Willie could have played every position and played it well.
All
probably
three
right.
of
You're
Lou's
probably
play
right.
the outfield.
Harvey, I
I
think he
was
went
there.
1 for 10 in that second game. Willie,
Oh, for
I
10?
think he was 1 for 10. 1 for 10,
1 for 10.
I believe.
Who? Willie?
Willie Mays, 1 for 10 in the.
I don't
second
believe
game.
that.
I check a box score. I'm sure of it.
Nah, the box score's wrong. Willie went 5 for 10.
And
And that's the story I'm sticking with.
the New York Times is never wrong. That's why I don't have sports anymore.
Yeah, the
That's
athletic,
right.
whatever. Yeah.
Athletic, yeah, boo.
Lou, I have one final quick
Thanks,
question
Lou.
to tie this up, if I could, please. Lou, can you give us a number? And I think you probably know it. Can you tell us how many newspapers you've written for?
Oh, I don't know. You're counting freelance too?
Well, no, you're on staff. I mean, it sounds like you were a staff writer everywhere.
Well, I kind of worked my up circulation. Like right out of college, I worked for a 10,000 circulation paper outside of Boston, and then a 50,000 circulation paper, and then the 125,000 Syracuse paper. And then it was more of a lateral thing for the Jacksonville paper at 150,000. And then I went from there to the Philadelphia Inquirer. And then
It's good.
I took a vacation in Alaska and loved it. And I went there and stayed for 17 years. And if I hadn't been dynamited out of there by the offer I got from Chicago, I would have stayed there forever. I mean, we still have a daughter and grandchildren in Anchorage. And I stay very close contact with people from Alaska. And I have I'm on email every day with at least one person I bet from Alaska. And, I know the Iditarod Trail sled dog race starts Saturday, for example. And, I don't know if I want to move back there for the winter, and it's not practical to move a household at this age, I think, either. But, and then, so the Chicago Tribune was an offer I couldn't refuse. That changed me. That got me out of Alaska, and I guess you could say I would have stayed. But the way the business is these days, with layoffs and cutbacks and everything, it's crazy. And you're not even safe in a big paper.
Hey, Lou, I worked for the Chicago Sun-Times for 7 years, but not in Chicago, in New York, in their advertising sales office.
Okay.
And they took us in the summertime. We had sales meetings, allegedly. Mostly we went to either Comiskey or Wrigley. They had suites, and we all got bombed. The liquor never stopped. The food was great, especially at Wrigley. I became a Cub fan for that 1 or 2 days that I was in Chicago for our sales meetings.
I think I've only been in a suite of any kind at a ballpark twice. And once was in Cleveland. And I had become friendly with the president of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame because he used to work in Cooperstown. And my wife and I had never been to an Indians game. And I wrote to him and said, we're coming to town, want to go to a game. He said, oh, I'll get the tickets. When we got there, it turned out it was in a suite. He had borrowed somebody. So that's how I got in the suite. And and I'm a SABR member with the Louisville Club, the Louisville chapter, with the Pee Wee Reese chapter. And they have an event at the minor league stadium once a year. And we went a year or so ago on that. So suites are a foreign correspondent concept, excuse me, to me.
I love.
Not something I will ever be able to afford.
I enjoyed my 2 or 3 trips to the suites. They were fun.
There you go.
Lou, I gotta throw one more in, because you mentioned the Chicago Tribune. When you were with the Tribune, did you know a managing editor there by the name of Jim Hagelin? Did you know Jim?
No.
No? Okay. I went to college with Jim.
When I first went there were I
Oh, God.
believe
Sorry,
600 people in editorial.
Oh,
Now there's probably 60. I don't know. But
okay.
yeah.
Lou, thank you so much for this evening. Let's give it up for Lew Freedman.
Thank you, Gary.
Ask a question, Gary?
Yes,
Lou?
please.
Book, brand new. We wish you.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question.
You bet. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Why you mentioned hundreds, not hundreds, but a number of sports writers, but nobody's mentioned Roger Angel, who was probably the best sports writer of all time.
Terrific.
Time. Hmm?
He was terrific.
Yeah, but nobody mentioned him.
No, I think they were
Nobody-
just,
nobody was
I think they
better
were
than Roger
mostly
Angel.
talking about the newspaper guys, not the magazine guys,
A
when they
writer
brought
is a
him up.
writer.
And I never met him. I mean, certainly read him, but I never met him.
I know, but you didn't even mention him.
So
Okay, and I had another question. You come from Southern Indiana now, you live in Southern Indiana. Do you follow the high school state basketball championships?
not that much. I'm paying attention this year just a little bit to a 2A school in the area, but I don't write high school sports.
No, I know, but
Yeah, I did though. I did.
prevalent.
There's a kid who's a great player who's from the area, whose father was a record holder, whose sister played college ball, and they're about, and they just won their first sectional game the other day. So I'm just kind of paying attention to that one school, really.
Uh-huh. What school is it?
Brownstown Central,
Yeah. Mhm.
because the
Good.
kid's going to Purdue.
We wish you
Good for him.
available on Amazon. Hopefully in the next couple of months, we'll get you back to speak about your new book on. Okay.
That will be fun. Anytime.
We'll see you in a couple of months. Don't
Thank you,
be.
Gary.
Give it up for Lew Freedman.
Impressive. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
We will hang around, talk about Giant baseball, but we'll
Good
see you next Thursday with Greg Elliott, the Giants
He's great.
groundskeeper. Good night, everybody.